everybody, welcome to Learn with Steph. This is one of the videos as part of our Lessons in Law series. The focus is on OCR A Level Law, but it will be useful to anybody studying law. If you like the videos, please do subscribe and press the like button at the bottom. This is our third lesson on delegated legislation. And today we're going to continue looking at controls. How is delegated legislation controlled? In our previous lesson, we focused on parliamentary controls. This lesson is going to focus on how delegated legislation is controlled by the courts, so judicial controls. And then we will evaluate them. In our previous lesson, we talked about how parliamentary controls happen before the piece of delegated legislation has been passed. However, judicial controls happen afterwards. In any judicial controls essay, after you've explained very briefly why delegated legislation has to be controlled, you're going to go through some basics. You need to name the procedure, and that procedure is called judicial review. And judicial review happens in the Queen's Bench Division of the High Court. Basically, any piece of delegated legislation can be challenged in the courts by any individual under this judicial review procedure. Courts don't have the power to amend delegated legislation or to change it in any way, but if a piece of delegated legislation is found to be ultra vires, that means beyond the powers, it will be ruled void, which means it will no longer exist. There are two key types of ultra vires, substantive and procedural. Substantive ultra vires means that the delegated legislation has gone beyond the powers set out in the Enabling Act. In our previous lesson, we talked about Enabling Acts. They're a form of parliamentary controls. An Enabling Act will enable delegated legislation to happen in the first place. It says who can make it, what can be made, and the procedure that needs to be gone through for it to be valid. Substantive ultra vires is looking at the what. So if something is called substantive ultra vires, it means that the person producing the piece of delegated legislation has done something other than what the Enabling Act has allowed them to do. In other words, they've gone beyond the powers set out in that Enabling Act. A case for this involves Fulham Corporation. Notice I've cut down your learning here. You can just call it the Fulham Corporation case. In the Enabling Act, Fulham Corporation was given the power to build public washing facilities. Instead of this, it built a laundry, and this was declared ultra vires. The second type of ultra vires is procedural. If a piece of delegated legislation is held to be procedurally ultra vires, it means that the correct procedure laid down in the Enabling Act has not been followed. Usually, this means people that are supposed to have been consulted haven't been consulted. And this was the case in the Aylesbury mushrooms case, where the Minister of Labour failed to consult mushroom growers. They were an interested party relevant to that piece of delegated legislation. So in Aylesbury mushrooms, the delegated legislation was made void due to it being procedurally ultra-vires. Another way that a judicial review could hold a piece of delegated legislation to be void is if they believe the law is unreasonable. This is sometimes also called the Wednesbury principle, named after the case Wednesbury. And in that case, it banned teenagers from attending a local cinema. And this rule was held to be unreasonable and therefore void. A more modern case that illustrates this concept of unreasonableness is Rogers v. Swindon, National Health Service Trust. In this case, a woman was prescribed breast cancer drugs, but the trust refused to let her have those drugs due to cost. Those drugs were available for some patients, but they refused to give it to that patient. The court declared this ruling, this decision, as unreasonable. You can also challenge a piece of delegated legislation under the Human Rights Act. If a court finds that a statutory instrument conflicts with the Human Rights Act 1998, it will be declared void. A really recent case of the John Warboys taxi driver rapist illustrates this idea. In this case, the victims took the parole board to judicial review and also the police. They challenged the parole board for their decision to release John Warboys, and they won. And they challenged the police on decisions that the police made during the investigation. They did all this under the Human Rights Act 1998 using judicial review procedure. You also need to evaluate judicial controls, just like you did with parliamentary controls. Can you already see what problems there might be with judicial controls? Think back to why delegated legislation has to be controlled. Do you think these controls are enough? The first point you could think about is how limited the courts are. Because the courts can actually only declare a piece of delegated legislation void if a citizen challenges that delegated legislation in court. And obviously, taking anything to judicial review costs money and time. So there's probably a lot of delegated legislation out there that does go against the rules laid down in the Enabling Act, but just has never been challenged by a citizen. The courts can't just decide to look at a piece of delegated legislation because they think it might be beyond the powers. They have to wait until it is challenged in court by someone. So the power is limited. And even if a citizen does challenge a piece of delegated legislation in courts, it is an individual against a public body. And public bodies have a lot more money and a lot more resources to support, to defend their law in comparison to an individual. So there's quite a big imbalance of power here, because an individual is not going to qualify for any legal aid or legal funding from the state to do this. You could get a 10-mark question of describe judicial controls on delegated legislation. Your essay would need to cover 10 clear AO1 marks. And don't forget, we're looking here at the OCR A Level course. You would start your essay with a very brief sentence about why controls are needed. You will talk about the fact that judicial controls happen after the delegated legislation has been passed. It takes place in the Queen's Bench Division of the High Court under the judicial review procedure, which is where a citizen can challenge a piece of delegated legislation. You would talk about how a court will decide whether the law is beyond the powers, using the Latin words ultra vires. And you must always say what the result might be of a successful judicial review hearing. That the piece of delegated legislation would be deemed void. You need to talk about procedural ultra vires, which you would need to define and then illustrate. And you would need to talk about substantive ultra vires, which you would need to define and you would need to illustrate. And for both those illustrations, you would probably need to mention a little bit about the facts of the case in order to illustrate how the judicial review procedure works. You'd talk about unreasonable challenges using an illustration. And it would be great to finish with a reference to the Human Rights Act 1998. Have a go at this question and try to do it to time using just 10 minutes. Finally, you could get a question to choose either to write about parliamentary controls or judicial controls. And it's quite a straightforward question, as you can see, because both sides have really clear 10 points that you can cover. And they're on the screen now. Make sure you can do both of these essays to time in 10 minutes. So we've now covered what delegated legislation is, the different types of delegated legislation, how delegated legislation is controlled both in Parliament before it's passed and in the courts afterwards, and we've evaluated these controls. The next lesson is the evaluation, and we talk about why delegated legislation is necessary, which are the advantages, and what are the problems with delegated legislation. That brings us to the end of this lesson in law. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like it and subscribe to find more videos. Bye.